Okay, so today we are going to talk about the motif of fire in A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Hopefully you should already know a little bit about this, but this video should give you a bit more insight into how the motif of fire is used and what it says about the different characters in the novella. Quick question, how many times is the word fire used throughout the novella? Have a guess? Answer in fact is 39, which is quite a lot of mentions of the word fire, so clearly a very important motif for Dickens. We'll get into why now. We should all be familiar with the two famous similes that are used to describe Scrooge at the beginning of Stave 1. Solitary as an oyster and hard and sharp as flint. But what you might not have focused on is the mention of fire in the second simile. Dickens writes, "Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire." So Scrooge is described as being hard and sharp like flint, which is an implement that used to be used to create a flame to start a fire. What Dickens is implying here, in my opinion, is that Scrooge has the potential for warmth and kindness. However, he hasn't ever used it. The first time that we really see the motif of fire in A Christmas Carol is in Stave 1. Dickens writes, "Scrooge had a very small fire, but his clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like just one coal." Now, this reveals something that we all know about Scrooge. Firstly, that he's selfish. He refuses to help other people out, and he refuses to extend any warmth or kindness to them. That's what fire represents throughout the novella, warmth and kindness. That his refusal to give Bob Cratchit any more than just one coal, even on Christmas Eve, really hammers that point home. He is not a kind man. But this quote actually reveals something a little bit more interesting. Unlike a typically selfish person who would give his clerk just one coal but give himself a big roaring fire, Scrooge doesn't even extend kindness to himself. Here, Dickens is giving us a little clue. He's not just your typical selfish man. He's actually very, very sad, very, very lonely, and very unwilling to extend kindness even to himself. That's why Dickens includes this detail. Scrooge had a very small fire. Fire is mentioned a couple of times in Stave 2 of Christmas Carol. This is when the ghost of Christmas past takes Scrooge back into earlier parts of his life to reveal lessons that he should have learnt along the way. The first time it's mentioned is in Scrooge's childhood. He is described as a lonely boy reading near a feeble fire. This is in the context of Scrooge having been left alone at school, abandoned by his father and his friends over the Christmas period. And the idea of him reading by a feeble fire suggests that he didn't receive any warmth and kindness in his own upbringing. It's the feeble attitudes of the people around him in terms of looking after him and caring for him that have made him into the selfish person he later becomes. However, fire is also mentioned again in the description of Fezziwig. Dickens writes, "Fuel was heaped upon the fire." The use of that verb heaped rather than just placed or put shows that there was so much fuel that it was almost too much, and that's representative of Fezziwig's generosity. He is so kind to everybody around him that he always goes above and beyond what is expected. Fire is also mentioned on a few occasions in Stave 3 by the Ghost of Christmas Present. There's a couple of paragraphs in Stave 3 which, if you're not reading carefully, can get overlooked. And these deal with the miners, the men who work at the lighthouse, and the sailors. What these are meant to be, even though they're not big characters, are representations of working class, poor people who do difficult, isolated jobs and yet still manage to take the time out of their day to celebrate Christmas, unlike Scrooge, who has a lot of luxury but doesn't bother to celebrate the holiday. And here we can see examples of that. First, in the lighthouse, Dickens writes, "Two men who watched the light had made a fire." So even though these two men were all alone, separated from their families and friends, out doing a really lonely, difficult job on a lighthouse, they still managed to light a fire, spread that warmth and generosity and friendship between them. Similarly, down the mines, Dickens writes, "A cheerful company assembled around a glowing fire." And again, we see the image of fire bringing people together. Because remember, it's not just about the physical warmth that fire provides, it's about its symbolism as something about friendship and kindness. In stave 4, The Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come takes Scrooge to see the Cratchit family, among others. And one of the descriptions that Dickens lays out for us is the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. So again, we've got this idea of a very poor family still bothering to pay for fuel or coal to start a fire, buying chestnuts, which was sort of Christmas time treat, very popular in the Victorian era, and coming together, spreading warmth, spreading cheer. Massive contrast to the images we've had of Scrooge with his tiny fires and his cold house and office. Stave 5 is very much about Dickens revisiting our first impression of Scrooge and showing us the ways in which he's changed. For example, you should know that he buys Bob Cratchit's family a turkey and raises his salary, but he does something else too. He says to Bob, "Make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit." So, by telling him to make up the fires, this is a clear representation that Scrooge has decided to embrace the values of warmth, kindness, friendship and generosity. But there's another detail here. He tells Bob Cratchit to buy another coal scuttle, where the coal would have been kept to make sure the fires were burning generously, before he dots another I. Now, Bob Cratchit is Scrooge's clerk, so dotting I's would have been shorthand for doing the work he needed to do to make Scrooge money. So by telling Bob to prioritise the fire over dotting the I's, what Scrooge is really saying is that he cares more about making the people in his life happy than he does about making any more money. And that's when we see the very clear change that A Christmas Carol is all about.